Joining us now to talk more about his new book about Canada's prime ministers, the importance of Canadian history and the figures who shaped it. Very pleased to welcome to the program here J.D.M. Stewart. He's a writer, historian, one of Canada's leading experts on Canada's prime ministers. And his new book, it's called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. James, so great to have you with us here. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here.
Let's start by talking about why you think this book is needed and kind of what prompted you to write this in the first place.
hmm Well, I've been a history teacher for 30 years, and I've always felt that Canadian history was very important, but also the leadership story of Canada is very important. And believe it or not, it's been more than 25 years since anyone has written a book chronicling the history of Canadian prime ministers. You have to go back to 1999, a book by Jack Granatstein and Norm Hilmer. There was also one in 1994 called Right Honorable Men by Michael Bliss, but that's a long time ago. That's the 1990s. And we have had a whole swath of history over the last quarter century. And so I felt that it was time to bring to a new generation of readers, a new generation of Canadians who might not be up to speed on this history. I thought it'd be time to bring this kind of a book to the marketplace.
Well, it's interesting because writing a biography of any one individual is quite a task. So this is
Yes.
almost like writing smaller biographies of a whole bunch of Canadian prime ministers. And I mean, did you consider focusing on maybe just one or two, or what was the approach you wanted to bring here?
I wanted to have an all-encompassing single volume book that any Canadian could pick up and have as a handy reference any prime minister in Canadian history from Sir John A. Macdonald to Mark Carney, because the book does include a short chapter on Mark Carney. So, obviously, because I was writing about 24 different prime ministers, you can't include every single thing about them. And part of the time when I was writing this book, I was like, this could actually be a 600-page book because there's a lot to say.
Yeah. No kidding.
So I think, you would miss something if you only focused on, say, the four most important prime ministers in Canadian history or something like that. So I wanted there to be something for everybody and something that covered the whole entire period of Canadian history from 1867 to the present.
Well, it's interesting that question of what counts as history. I mean, I think for a lot of people, it depends maybe on how old you are and what you've seen in your lifetime. There's sort of that line between these figures who are history and those who are very contemporary, the politicians of today versus kind of these giant looming figures of history. And I guess there really is no clear dividing line there, is there?
No, but I would say that anyone who served as Prime Minister of Canada was a piece of our history. In fact, I quote the well-known journalist and writer Peter C. Newman, who's now deceased. I quote him in my introduction and say, an hour in the office of the Prime Minister is an hour in the history of the country. So prime ministers have made a huge impact on Canadian history, and it's important that we understand them. Of course, there are other elements of Canadian history that are important if you want to get into, say, social history or military history or other aspects. But history at the leadership level, at the prime ministerial level, is very important. And in some cases, it's been kind of pushed aside by some of the other types of history that have been coming to the fore. But this is another reason why I wanted to write the book, was to bring forward this top level leadership based history of Canada.
Yeah. I mean, you take two recent figures, Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, and they were very
Yeah.
consequential in their own way. They're
Yes.
still very much a product of this era and strong feelings on both sides. We think of them as politicians. Like, we don't think of them yet, I think,
Yeah.
as historical figures. Is that to say that in 20, 50, 75 years, the way in which we think about these individuals will be different?
Yes, I mean, I think that goes without saying. It's a really good point that you bring up, Rob. Um, in history, you need distance in order to really make a dispassionate judgment on a historical figure. So in some ways, writing chapters about Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, they were some of the more challenging chapters for me to write because they're still very fresh in our memories. So the interpretations of both of their times in office will change in the ensuing years. I think Harper's time in office, he's been out of office, believe it or not, for 10 years now, which is a big chunk of time.
Wow.
I think the perspectives on his time in office are already starting to change as you see, okay, well, here's how Justin Trudeau handled his years in office. And that to some degree makes Stephen Harper's years in office look a little bit different. And so 25 years from now, we will certainly be looking at both of these men's time in office a little bit differently than we do today.
Mhm. When we look at prime ministers, there were those who accomplished what we would consider to be great things, and there were
Yes.
those who had great political success. And I suppose those are not necessarily the same things. But how do we disentangle the two to assess who these individuals were, the impact that they had?
Well, you've got to look at the impact of the achievements or of the legislation. So, let's take a couple of examples. Sir John A. Macdonald and the construction of the railway. That is still a long-lasting impact on Canada still today. Our railways are still some of the most important things that are part of the infrastructure of Canada. If you look at a prime minister like Louis Saint Laurent, who doesn't get a lot of attention, but he was really successful in positioning Canada for the post Second World War era by getting us into NATO. He also built the Trans Canada Highway. So if you look at, I always like to see how long lasting were the achievements of the prime ministers. And one of the things I try to do in the book also is look at their legacies post prime ministership. And some prime ministers last longer in the Canadian psyche than others. Pierre Trudeau is another prime minister, and he's been out of office for more than 40 years, but his time in office is still having repercussions in various ways.
Mhm. When it comes to knowing about these individuals, and it goes back, I guess, to how we approach history and teach history, and maybe it's about the things that happened as opposed to the people who caused those things to happen. And I don't know, maybe we're less inclined than the Americans, to put historical figures on a pedestal.
Yeah.
What do you make of how we teach history? And is this book in part trying to fill a void?
It's definitely trying to fill a void. It depends on where you live in the country. For example, I live in Ontario, where there is a required course in Canadian history in high school in grade 10, whereas in Alberta, there is no defined Canadian history course that a student must take to graduate from high school. There's a social studies course that is a mishmash of economics, civics, geography, and other things. So there are holes in the Canadian education system. There are also holes just in the Canadian historical understanding because, as you were mentioning, the Americans, they're publishing books about American history all the time. They have their documentaries, they have even
Yeah.
their films, which films can pique interest in history, but I wouldn't mix them up with an understanding of history. But I am trying to fill a void, and I think there is more casual interest in Canadian history right now as we are searching for some of the ties that bind in this country during the period where some of our sovereignty as a nation is being threatened by the United States. And so this is an opportunity for Canadians to pick up a book that's written for the general audience and say, oh, I didn't know that. This is kind of interesting to see how our country unfolded.
Well, I think you're right. I think history can be unifying. We've seen recently in ways in which it can be dividing, and I mean that gets
Yes.
us into, I guess, what we could call the statue debates. Much of that is around John A. Macdonald, but not
Hmm.
exclusively. And the sort of reckoning with certain aspects of the past, but going from kind of lionizing individuals from the past to almost villainizing
Right.
figures from the past.
Well, this is, there are a lot of uses and abuses in history, and that's a reference to a title of a book by historian Margaret Macmillan, who talks about bad history, where people use selective bits of history to try to make a point instead of using a balanced and very informed look at a historical subject. And John A. Macdonald, I think, is one historical figure who has suffered from a very particular uh, small focus on his legacy as opposed to looking at the whole thing. So history is a very funny thing, as you mentioned. It can be used and abused, and people use it to advance an agenda, as opposed to, which is my view, I like to advance an understanding. And so, to advance an understanding, you've got to look at both sides of the issue. And these are the kinds of things that I do in my book. I address the statue issue of Sir John A. Macdonald. I address his Indigenous policy, both for the good parts of it and the bad parts of it. And to me, that balanced approach is what's important when you're trying to develop historical understanding.
What do you think makes somebody statue worthy, I guess, if we can put it that way. I mean, a statue of John A. Macdonald is not a way of saying that this is this perfect individual
Right.
we almost aspire to. I think maybe it's more of a recognition of historical significance and impact. But how do you approach that question?
Well, I think the notion of who we might build a statue to today is changing. We are much less inclined to revere leadership people in our society today. I think we have appreciation for the ordinary citizen who has done great things. Terry Fox would be a great example, and there are
Right.
others. Community leaders. It depends on where you live, but we're for good or ill. We don't really want to lionize people who were in leadership positions anymore. So that's kind of changing. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think whether there's a statue or not, we still need to pay attention to the people that the Canadian people have asked to lead the country during the elections that happen every few years. So whether they deserve a statue or not, I think that's for future generations to decide. We can decide who our own heroes are, and that's what we do.
Mhm.
I think we're more focused. I think also on people who bring us pleasure, athletes, musicians,
Sure.
um, literary stars, people of this nature. So we look other places than politics now.
Right. And really, ultimately, I guess the first step in assessing whether someone deserves a statue or deserves recognition or whatever the case is to at least know who they were, know
Yeah,
what they did, know the impact
yeah.
they had. It's ultimately, we need to know the history first.
The other thing, Rob, I would say is, you know, there is this false belief that if we built a statue to someone that they must have been a god, or they
Yeah.
must have been a
Right.
perfect person. And if there's anything we can take away from this polarizing statue vandalizing ridiculousness that happened over the last 5 years, I think it would be to understand that everybody is human. And if you're in a leadership position, or you're the school principal, or you're the firefighter down the street, we're all human. And there's lots of things we've done to celebrate, but people make mistakes too. And also,
Mhm.
people are products of their time. So these are things we need to understand and have a little grace and humanity when we're looking at people from the past,
Yeah. When
or
we
even
talk
in the
about
present, to be frank, right? Even in the present,
well,
we
sure.
should all
Yeah,
have grace and
exactly.
humanity towards each other.
Yeah. As the title implies, these are individuals who shaped our history, and maybe there's the tendency to think that history was just going to unfold as it did, regardless of who was in power. Almost like these people coincided with history as opposed to shaping it. When you look at the nature of our system and the role that these individuals play, is it fair to give them that amount of credit for what happened during their tenures? The suggestion maybe that it wouldn't have. I mean, the formation of Canada is a big question. Maybe it
Yeah.
still would have happened without
hmm
McDonald, for example. But how much credit do you think prime ministers deserve here?
Well, there's two things I'd say in response to you there, Rob. And one is that in history, nothing is inevitable. You can change
Yeah.
one circumstance before, and that can completely change the outcome of an event. So nothing is inevitable. Number two is history is sometimes described as a collision between character and circumstance. So it does depend on what the circumstances are, but it also depends on the character, the person who is there at the time. So if we take an example like the Second World War, Mackenzie King was the prime minister, and he had an uncanny ability to be able to not push things too far, get Canada muddling along, um, control, like exert Canadian sovereignty, placate Quebec or manage them as best they could. And he was successful and turned out to be our longest serving prime minister. People matter, decisions matter. The person at the top leading the way does make a difference. And if you look at any prime minister and read any chapter of my book, you'll see that decisions made by the prime minister have made a difference. You just choose whatever prime minister you want, and you're going to see that that's the result.
Yeah. And it's interesting too when you think about what might have or could have been. I mean, you talk in the book about a figure that probably most of us don't know much about or think much about, John Thompson, a prime minister who I think maybe much was expected of, ended up
Yes.
actually dying in office. Right? These kinds of examples.
Yeah. I mean, I guess an example of what could have happened. For example, if Sir John Thompson had not died of a heart attack in Windsor Castle, it's kind of an interesting story. He was having lunch with Queen Victoria in 1894, and he had a heart attack and died and then was sent home on a morning ship. But the issue there was what could have happened with him. And he didn't get a chance to fulfill his leadership abilities. He had quite a few, but things happen and people get bumped out of office. For another example would be 1979, when Pierre Trudeau lost to the Joe Clark Progressive Conservatives. People thought Trudeau's time in office was over. But then a
Right.
year later, he won the 1980 election, and we know that from 80 to 84, a lot happened.
Yeah, yeah, to say the least. But it is funny too. Trudeau in those last 4 years does something incredibly consequential, significant to his legacy. But the Liberals are drummed out of office. So Brian Mulroney, brings in free trade, and this is so crucial to his legacy. He goes down toward the end as one of the most unpopular prime ministers ever. It's sort of that double-edged sword of legacy, or the doing the things that matter, but also the political consequences of the day.
Right. The Mulroney example is a really good one that you raise because, as you say, he was the most unpopular prime minister in Canadian history when he left office in 1993. But then when he died last year in 2024, there were hardly any bad words spoken about his time in office. This is the whole thing I was talking about at the beginning of our talk, where when time passes on, the interpretations of prime ministers change, and Mulroney's post prime ministership was very much an up and down period, but at his death, he's ended very much up in terms of people's analysis of his time in office.
What's your read on how these individuals, the ones who serve in this position, hold this office? Do you think they appreciate the history of it, the gravity of it, the potential for that kind of lasting legacy?
Yeah, I think all prime ministers, I think they all come into the office for good reasons, to try to make Canada a better place. I think any prime minister always has an eye on history and legacy. What will they be remembered for? And I'm quite certain that drives a lot of their decisions, particularly um, at the beginning of their time in office, but even more so as the longer they get in office, they start thinking about, well, what will I be remembered for? So they're very much aware of their place in history. And Stephen Harper, just as another example, he was a big fan of Canadian history and prime minister history. Read the biographies of Diefenbaker, was a big appreciator of the political skills of Jean Chrétien. So many of these men in office, Mackenzie King, for example, loved Laurier too. So they're all very cognizant of their place in Canadian history. And remember, it's a pretty small club. There's only been 24 people in the history of Canada to have been prime minister.
Yeah. You mentioned Diefenbaker, and I spoke with another author recently who'd written a book about Diefenbaker. And part of what he was trying to get across is maybe how underappreciated Diefenbaker was. Did you feel that there are those, I don't know if unsung heroes is the right way to put it, but
Right.
maybe prime ministers who didn't quite get the due they deserved?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of our prime ministers just get forgotten. So
Right.
Diefenbaker is one who gets forgotten. But my go-to person to answer this question would be Louis Saint Laurent. He served in office from 1948 to 1957, and really positioned Canada for the post Second World War era. He got us into NATO. He set out what a strong foreign policy would be. St. Lawrence Seaway was built during that time. Trans Canada Pipeline. So but he's not well remembered. You don't see his name in other history books or reference to him in speeches or newspaper articles. He's kind of the forgotten prime minister, to be honest.
So coming out of this, and we talked about the statue debate and how we approach history, and there is this sense now too that maybe we're talking about this club of old white men, and maybe it's not
Right.
fashionable to spend a lot of time thinking about them or holding them up as heroes of history. But do you think there's an opportunity here? Are we at a bit of a turning point? Do you think when it comes to knowing and appreciating our history?
I hope we are, and maybe we'll find out depending on how many books I can sell on this topic. But I think it does ebb and flow sometimes. So I was remembering in the 1990s when it was the 50th anniversary of D-Day from the Second World War, 1994. There seemed to be an increased an increased interest in Canadian military history for some time. And now, again, because of what's happening in our relationship with the United States, people are wondering about the ties that bind us. And hopefully, this is a period where we are trying to develop a greater understanding of who we were as a nation. But it's up to Canadians themselves how far they want to go with trying to understand ourselves. But I do think we are at a turning point like that.
The book is called The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders, and the Nation They Shaped. J.D.M. Stewart, thank you so much for joining us here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rob.
Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.